Tales of the Caballos, Part 2, The Depression Era. Author's note. In Part 2, I have tried to capture the major players of the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s until the middle 1970s, when the era of lawlessness finally ended on the Caballo Mountains. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. Thank you. This was an era of desperation and struggle. Life was hard, and there were no government handouts to relieve the suffering. Don't judge these people too harshly. They only did what they had to, at the time, to survive. Part 2, Chapter 1, Mrs Perez and the Reynolds boy. This story marks the beginning of what could be called the new era of treasure hunting on the Caballo Mountains. Although this story began during the depths of the Great Depression, it has no bearing on the Doc Nah story or the Palmer brothers, who both existed about the same time this story unfolds. Doc Nah got his information directly from Geronimo while incarcerated at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, but it is unknown where the Palmer brothers acquired their information. Both were known to be successful in their endeavors on the mountain. It all began when a young man by the name Jack Reynolds was hitchhiking through New Mexico. It was late at night and a storm was in progress when a man who had given Jack a ride offered to take him to some ruins that would offer him some shelter for the night. This offer Jack quickly accepted. He did not want to spend the night exposed to the elements if he had a choice. The unnamed Samaritan took Jack to some U.S. Army ruins called Fort Selden, a fort that has been hastily erected shortly after the Civil War and was occupied by the U.S. cavalry for a period of time when New Mexico was still a territory. Jack quickly found shelter from the rain and was soon busy looking for dry kindling to get a fire started with. It was during this search he found some papers stuffed in the crack of one of the walls of the fort. Upon closer inspection, Jack could see that these were detailed maps but written in Spanish. He wisely chose not to destroy them and found other material to get the fire going with. The maps are thought to have been left by the outlaw Joaquin Warranabel, a Mexican bandit who was captured with 200 of his men and executed by the U.S. cavalry at Fort Selden. This is a reasonable explanation of how the Spanish maps turned up in an English-speaking fort. No one knows for sure. Unable to read Spanish, Jack was in a quandary. What could he do to get these maps deciphered without losing them to an unscrupulous person? The answer was waiting for him less than 60 miles up the road in a town called Hot Springs. The details of how Jack Reynolds and Mrs. Perez got together are obscure, but they quickly formed a close partnership. Mrs. Perez would translate the maps while Jack Reynolds would locate the entry points. Soon there was a steady stream of gold bars coming out of the mountain, carried by Jack Reynolds and disposed of by Mrs. Perez. It is told that Mrs. Perez learned the hard way of how to dispose of gold bars. She allegedly took 2 gold bars to the U.S. Mint in Denver and was then told, "If you can prove that these bars belonging to you, we, the United States, would then consider paying you for them." Needless to say, no more gold bars were taken to the mint by Mrs. Perez. In those days, before owning gold was illegal, it was relatively simple to find private parties to buy them, or simply take the gold to Mexico and sell it. Disposing of gold became a big deal only after private ownership of gold was abolished by Teddy Roosevelt. In retrospect, this law was punitive in nature and created much hardship on those fortunate enough to acquire this metal. It wasn't until President Nixon repealed the law in 1978 that American citizens could again own gold legally. Most of what is known about Mrs. Perez we have John Vance to thank for. John and his twin brother spent countless hours listening to her stories about the mountain, and many more hours relating them to people like me. I am certain that she walked the depths of this magical mountain and savored all of its treasure. In her younger years, she was never a greedy woman and took only what she needed from the mountain. Mrs. Perez and Jack Reynolds searched with good success until a tragic ending occurred. This was when an insignificant telegraph operator named Willie Dohit got wind of the maps owned by Jack Reynolds. It has never been proven because no body was ever found, but Willie all but admitted to Mrs. Perez that because of him, she would never see Jack Reynolds alive again. Jack's leather jacket was found with a bullet in the back of it in a place called Dark Canyon, a very inaccessible canyon nestled between Cable and Burbank Canyons on the Caballo Mountains. The disappearance of Jack Reynolds ended the partnership between him and Mrs. Perez, but the legacy of the maps would endure to this day. The descriptions and locations as told by Mrs. Perez have launched many treasure hunts in the Caballo Mountains. Many of the forgotten treasure hunters owe their inspiration to the stories told by Mrs. Perez. The fact that she launched the career of Buster and Willie by indirectly providing them with the vital information makes her role in the Caballo Mountains history secure. She was surely one of the good people at a time when goodness was a lost virtue. Next up, Part 2, Chapter 2, Buster and Willie.